There is no question that in the short run, by allowing U.S. dollars to collapse, in effect voting millions of Americans off the island, there will be some disruptions of Asian economies. Of course, there will be some initial losers, particularly among those Asians who currently profit from the present arrangement. However, these profits come only at the expense of greater losses borne by the entire Asian population. In the end, the cessation of America's excess consumption, which is not a benefit Asians enjoy, but rather a burden they now disproportionately bear, will be the best thing that can happen to them. Like the serfs being liberated from their lords, their scarce resources will be freed up to satisfy their own needs and desires, and their standards of living will rise accordingly. As their savings finance increased capital investment, rather than being squandered on American consumption, their future standards of living will rise that much faster as well. China's wartime economy. As noted earlier with reference to Asia in general, the mainstream of economic thinking holds that China will continue to finance the U.S. current account deficit indefinitely, because American consumption is vital to the survival of China's export-driven economy. Quite to the contrary, China's own capacity to consume is much greater than ours, and the productive capacity needed to serve it is already in place in China. In many ways, the modern Asian economies are reminiscent of the wartime economy of the United States during World War II, when the nation's industrial might was concentrated on supplying the war effort. We had 10 million men under arms spread across 3 continents. Our ships patrolled the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Our bombers blackened the skies. Factories that had previously produced passenger cars, sewing machines, and farm equipment had been retooled to make fighter planes, jeeps, tanks, rifles, bullets, artillery shells, destroyers, aircraft carriers, submarines, uniforms, helmets, boots, mess kits, and military radios. At the time, we were a very busy nation. Our factories were operating 24/7, and more people than ever before were working, including legions of women previously absent from the workforce. Given this full-throttle activity, economists of that time period might have argued that we never should have stormed the beaches at Normandy or Iwo Jima. After all, if the war ended, a disaster would befall our wartime economy. Millions of soldiers and factory workers would lose their jobs, and corporate profits would collapse, as there would be no more demand for all the weapons and military equipment they were producing. Because victory abroad would surely bring recession at home, the war needed to be waged indefinitely. As ridiculous as this argument sounds, it is exactly what most believe the Chinese should do today, as in reality their export-driven economy is basically no different from our wartime economy in 1944. During the war, American consumers did not receive any direct economic benefit from their hard work and economic activity. In fact, they sacrificed greatly. Because factories were producing military goods, consumer goods were in short supply. In addition, scores of common staples, such as butter, nylon stockings, and gasoline, had to be rationed so that they, or the resources needed to produce them, would be readily available for the military. Similarly, Chinese citizens now produce export goods from which they themselves derive no direct economic benefit. In effect, consumer goods are rationed in China so as to make them plentiful in the United States. However, when World War II ended, American factories didn't shut down. They merely returned to consumer goods production. Soldiers didn't lose their jobs. They merely put their labor to more productive uses. Instead of being wasted on a war, which unfortunately had to be fought, resources were applied to civilian purposes, leading to a post-war economic boom. The same would apply to China today. As Americans once sacrificed to defeat the Nazis and Imperial Japan, the Chinese now sacrifice merely to support the purchasing power of Americans. If China allowed the dollar to decline against the yuan, American purchasing power would be, by definition, transferred to the Chinese. In China, factors of production would therefore be reallocated as they were during the post-war period in the United States. Factories would retool and labor would seek more productive employment. Instead of wasting scarce resources producing goods to export, China would instead produce goods for domestic consumption. The time has come for China, and the rest of Asia for that matter, to redirect their vast resources to raising their own standards of living, rather than propping up the living standards of Americans. As soon as the Chinese stop producing goods for Americans, they can finally begin producing more for themselves. It's time for China to declare peace. Unfortunately, as Americans are the principal profiteers in China's war, we stand to lose the most when it ends. So while peace means China's days of sacrifice, rationing, and underconsumption will soon end, it means ours are about to begin. Unfortunately for Americans, being decoupled from the Asian gravy train means it's time to get back to work. In the simple terms of our island castaways analogy, this means a whole lot more hunting and fishing, in the commercial sense, and a whole lot less eating.